This is the book that's causing all the problems. And this is the book that we've got to confront. And this is the book that we are confronting. And what we're finding out about this book is amazing. Now, there's some stuff that I'm going to introduce tonight you've never heard before. And the reason why is because I've never heard of it before until just recently. And I spent 37 years confronting this book. I did my doctoral thesis on this book. And yet when I was doing my doctorate, when I was doing my master's also on the Qur'an, we never had the material that we have today. We never had this kind of material to use against the Qur'an. And a question you may ask is, why even talk about the Qur'an? Gary, could I get some water? Maybe a glass of water so I can just, or can I use this? Is this okay? There's no arsenic in it, is there? So when you look at the Qur'an, you need to do a comparison between these two books real quickly. And when you look at these two books, you can see they really are completely two different categories of literature. We would never make the claims about the Bible that the Muslims make about the Quran. And so let's start with their claims. The Quran, they say, is eternal. Who knows why they say it's eternal? Does anybody know the reason? Any idea? Say again? In tablets up in heaven. And that's in the Quran itself, isn't it? In chapter 85, verse 22. So it's an internal claim. It's not something that they have made up. It actually is internal to the Quran. The Quran makes that claim. So they've got to adhere to it. In chapter 85, verse 22, it talks about these eternal tablets. Now, by definition, if something is eternal, does that not mean it's co-equal to God? It's a conflict, isn't it? This is a duality. Only God is eternal. Am I correct? I've always been told that only God is eternal. So how can you have an inanimate object, a tablet, from which this book is derived, that is co-eternal with God? That means that claim in chapter 85, verse 22, is committing shirk. Shirk is the Arabic name for adding or putting alongside another with God. Anytime you equate a thing or a person with God, that is shirk. Someone who does that is a mushrik. The people who do that are mushrikun. We are mushrikun. That's the name they give us. Because they say we have elevated a prophet, Jesus, to the status of divinity. Therefore we're mushriks. We have committed shirk. Well, the Quran has committed shirk. And there was a group in the 10th century called the Mutazilites who did say that. They actually looked at that verse and they said, we've got to tear that out. That can't remain. Because how can you have a thing co-equal with God? How can you have something equal, eternal? Only God is eternal, and that's one of his definitions. That defines him. If you're going to have a tablet that's co-eternal, you have committed shirk. We have to tear that out. When they brought this to Mamun's court in the 9th century, the Qadarites, who were the ones who were an ascendancy at that time, killed every one of the Mutazilites. That's what they do in Islam. When they don't like something, they don't just sit there and debate it. They actually kill you. It's very clear. When you leave Islam, you get killed. It's called an apostate law. And anybody who's an apostate must be put to death. And that's in the Quran, chapter 4, verse 89. He who leaves Islam, kill him. Very simple. Every school of law, the Hanbali, the Hanafi, the Maliki, and the Shafi school, all four schools of law dictate that anybody who leaves Islam is an apostate. Apostates must be executed. The only difference between the four schools is which day you do it. Some say immediately, like the Hanbali school. The Hanafi and the Maliki school say that it must be in 3 days, and the Shafi school gives 10 days. That's it. But you must be executed. You must be executed. They do not take criticism. They do not take rejection. And that's why it's fascinating that those who actually brought this up as a problem in the 10th century were all killed off, all destroyed. And then the Qadarites shut down ijtihad. Ijtihad means to interpret the scriptures, and therefore no one could interpret scripture then for 1,000 years. Until 1905, when finally Muhammad Abduh in Cairo at Al-Azhar University reopened ijtihad. It is now open today. And so we're permitted now to critique the Quran. We're permitted now to actually ask these kind of questions. And you have all the right in the world to ask Muslims, what about that verse? Look at that verse. Does that not create a duality? Is that not suggest, therefore, there's someone else besides God, the eternal, and it's your book? So that's the first claim they make, that it is eternal. Secondly, the second claim they make is that it was sent down to a man named Muhammad between 610 and 632, or 22 years. So for 20 years, 610 to 622, he was revealed, this revelation came to him in Mecca, and then 622 to 632, the last 10 years, this revelation came to him in Medina. Two cities, Mecca, Medina, yeah. The Qur'an does talk about Gabriel quite a few times. Right there in chapter 19, that's Gabriel that comes to Mary. Jibril is his name in Arabic. So the source is the Qur'an itself. But the stories about Gabriel would be the hadith, yes. Doesn't say too much. It just says that he talks to Mary and says to her that she's going to have a righteous son. That's interesting. That's in chapter 19, verse 19. And in verse 20, he says to Mary, you will be a virgin when this happens. Truly, you are a virgin. So that's beautiful, because that's a bridge you can use to look at why the birth of Jesus is unique. So Gabriel is in the Quran. Jibril would the name would be. But also, Jibril is also known as the Spirit of God. Ru'ala. Now put that under your hat. So is he a spirit or is he an angel? Malaka. Both and. There's a lot of confusion in the Quran. Don't ask me to explain it. Ask Muslims. Let them have to deal with it. I'm so glad I don't have to defend the Quran. Now let's get back to this thing. So he is eternal. He is sent down to, the Quran is eternal. The Quran is sent down to a man named Muhammad for between 610 and 632, 22-year period. But Muhammad, curiously, did not write it down during his lifetime. And the reason they say is because he could not read or write. Is that a good excuse? Have any of you, does anybody here read and write Arabic? Okay. I don't speak Arabic, but I read and write Arabic, and it took me 2 weeks to read and write Arabic. There are only 28 letters in the Arabic alphabet. 7 of them are unique. All the others require either dots above or below the lines. 22 of them. 6 of them are unique. The other 22 require dots. It's not difficult to learn. It's not a very difficult script. So Muhammad would have had 22 years to learn the script. He already spoke it fluently. He was Arab. He grew up with Arabic. To read and write it would have not been at all difficult. Why didn't he learn to read and write it? If this was his only remit, this was his major remit in life. This was the one thing he was supposed to do, is receive this book and get it written down. He did not. So when he died, the Quran still had not been written down. It had been memorized by many of the companions. It was written on stones, on bones, on leaves, on bark. And all that I know because of Al-Bukhari, chapter 6 or volume 6, hadith number 509 and 510. So here you have a prophet, supposed prophet, who was given this eternal tablet that was then sent down to him piecemeal by an angel Gabriel, given to him in 2 different cities. He forgets to write it down and then dies in 632, unwritten. Which then means the first caliph that comes after him, Abu Bakr, is given that responsibility. And Abu Bakr takes on that responsibility, and he then takes the scribe of Muhammad. So Muhammad had a secretary. Isn't that interesting? So why didn't the secretary write it down while he was living? Isn't that the job of secretaries? Ask your Muslim question these. I have yet to see a Muslim that can explain this to me. Either Muhammad was inept, or he was such a proud man that he thought that he didn't need to write it down, but that's rather clumsy with God's greatest revelation. And the final revelation on top of that. So Abu Bakr, 2 years after Muhammad's death, had Zayd ibn Thabit go and find out everybody that had memorized and write down what their memory was, and then write down what he found on stones and bones and bark. Stones, bones, and bark. And put the first copy, the first recension of the Quran together. So that was done in 632 to 634, 2 years after Muhammad died. That copy was then given to one of the wives of Muhammad. Her name was Hafsa. She put it under her bed. Why? We don't know. It's obviously she didn't want to read it. If this was the greatest revelation finally written down, why don't you think she would have been curious enough to read it? What we do know is that 20 years later, at the time 652 then, the third caliph comes to power. Abu Bakr dies. Umar takes over from 634 to 644. He is killed. Uthman, the third caliph, takes over in 644, and he rules till 656. Now in 652, word has come to him that there are a multiplicity of Qur'ans that don't agree with the one that is given to Hafsa. But how does he know, since he doesn't have Hafsa's Qur'an? It's under her bed all this time. Nonetheless, they know that there are disagreements. So he says, okay, I want you to get Hafsa's copy. So he had Zayd ibn Thabit go and get Hafsa's copy, one of the wives of Muhammad. She gives it to them. So this is 20 years later. And he says, take that copy and rewrite it again. Why do you need to rewrite it if it's already written? And if you have any disagreement amongst you, and there was 4 of them that were given that responsibility, Zayd ibn Thabit, the secretary, Zubair and Harith, 3 others. The 4 of them were to rewrite the Quran again using Hafsa's copy. And if there were any disagreements, they were to rewrite it in the Quraishi dialect. Now, none of you speak Arabic here, but if you did speak Arabic, you'd know that immediately there's a problem there. Because dialectic differences, by definition, require dots above and below the line. That's how you get dialectic differences. Even more so, they require vowelization, the dhamma, the u sound. Dhamma, the u sound, which is a little curly Q above the line. The fatha, the a sound, which is a little sliver above the line. And the kasra, the e sound, which is a little tick below the line. U, a, e. Those are the 3 vowels in Arabic. That's it, only 3 vowels. Everything else is consonantal. Consonant after consonant after consonant. So how can you have dialectic differences in the 7th century when there were no diacritical marks in the 7th century? There was no vowelizations. Those weren't invented till the 8th and 9th century, 100 to 200 years later. Are you following me? No, not many of you. I can see I'm losing all of you. That's all right. You don't really have to know this. People like me have to know this because this is where we're hammering the Muslims. They have no idea how to answer that. And yet there it is. Write it in, if you have any dialectical differences, write it in the Qurayshi dialect. The reason why no one gets this, and the reason why even the Arabs certainly don't want to talk about it, is because that portion, that story, comes from a man named Al-Bukhari in the late 9th century. That's 240 years later. None of that we know about the Quran comes from the 7th century. We know nothing about the Quran from the 7th century. There's no writing whatsoever about any Quran at all in the same century that the Muhammad lived. It's all what they thought happened 240 years later, 870, redating it back to 632 and 652. Can you see a problem here? Are you starting to see the problem that's rising? Now, so they write the Quran in the Qurayshi dialect. Then Uthman goes and takes all the other manuscripts of the Quran and he burns them. Does that bother any of you? Why do you burn manuscripts? Any idea? To get rid of what evidence? Anything that disagrees. Am I correct? So obviously there must have been something that disagreed. Otherwise, what did he burn? Am I correct? Muslims, they strenuously try to deny that. No, that's not what he was burning. No, these are nothing more than dialectical differences that he was burning. There were no dialectical differences. Okay, these are nothing more than different ways of reading it. There is no way to read it if you don't have any ways to delineate the readings. That doesn't come in for another 100 to 200 years. And every time they make an excuse, we hammer them. That's why no Muslim will debate me on this anymore. They dare not debate us on this. They cannot debate us on this. And we're just getting started, folks. This is only the few of the first problems. So once they do that then, Uthman then commissions the one copy to be made into several copies, to one copy to be sent into every province of his kingdom. Now when you look at a map, you will see that there were 9 provinces at the time of Uthman. Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, Cairo, Alexandria, Aden, Herat, and Nishapur. Did you count 9? I counted 9. 9. 9 Qur'ans to 9 cities. When I was learning Islam and when I was getting my master's and doing my doctorate, I was only told there were 4 Qur'ans to 4 cities. Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, and Medina. That's it. That's what I always was told. I had no idea that there were actually 9 cities at the time of Uthman. That means they have to they have to show us, therefore, 9 Qur'ans from the time of Uthman. Because you're only talking about 1,400 years ago. That's not very long ago, is it? When you're talking about manuscripts. Remember, these are not papyrus. None of these are papyrus. These are vellum. These are parchment. These are manuscripts. These are codices that are written on animal skin. Animal skin is durable. If you have any doubt, take a look at what we have for parchment and vellum when it comes to the biblical manuscripts. Look and see what we've got in the British Library. Come to London, where I've been living for the last 25 years. Go look at the British Library, and you'll see the Sinaiticus right there, which is part of our tour. When we go people through the British Museum and the British Library, you'll see the Sinaiticus, the entire New Testament, from the time of the 4th century, between 325 and 350 AD. That is 300 years before the Qur'an. It is as pristine today as the day it was written. There's no blemish in it. It's a beautiful book. Right next to it is the Alexandrinus. The Alexandrinus is both the Old and the New Testament from the 5th century. That's 200 years before the Quran. If we could come up with those 2 manuscripts just in the British Library, you want to go down to the Vatican and you have the Vaticanus, which is again the New Testament, much like the Sinaiticus from the 4th century, though they're known as the 3 metropolitan codices. They are all 3 to 400 years before the Quran. What's fascinating is we can come up with 365 manuscripts of the New Testament alone, either partial or complete before the 6th century. All we're asking the Muslims is one. Just one of those 9 from the 7th century. One manuscript from the mid-7th century, complete and unchanged. That's all I'm asking. Is that too much to ask? Absolutely not.
Even worse than that, if you look at their even the partial, like the Birmingham, it doesn't even have Muhammad in it, doesn't have Mecca in it, doesn't have 114 service. That bothers me.
You mentioned the Birmingham folios.
Yeah.
Do you know the dates for them?
Well, actually, I think it's like
568
595.
to 645.
Yeah, so it actually,
When was Muhammad born? 570, died in 632.
so it actually predates it.
Okay, what's the problem with that manuscript right there? He's talking about the Birmingham folios. There's just 2 folios from circa 18, 19, and 20, which was discovered in in Birmingham, but it was discovered by carbon dating in the Oxford lab in 2015. 568 to 645. Do you see the problem with that? You notice no Muslim scholar has supported those dates. Why do you think? Well, Muhammad was there in 570.
Revelations in what, 610?
No, remember, what did I say? When was the Quran written down in its final form?
652.
652. So if the latest date of these carbon datings, the very latest date is 645. That's 7 years before 652. You can't have a manuscript or even folios that predate Uthman. And the only ones who got all up in arms, got so excited about it, was the BBC. Western scholars who didn't know the dates for Muhammad. That's why Muslim scholars have become very silent. They haven't said anything about it. It gets even worse than that. What's your name? Greg, it gets even worse than that, Greg. If you want to look and see, there's not just the Oxford lab. There's also the laboratory in Kiel, the Oxford lab. There's also the laboratory in Lille, and there's also the lab in Zurich. 4 different labs, all in Europe. They have now looked at the Sana manuscript, which is even older than the Birmingham folios. In fact, the Birmingham folios are supposedly from the Sana manuscript, and they've taken a look and they've done carbon dating on all 4 laboratories. Guess what the date they have for those carbon datings? Every one of them is prior to 550. Every one, and the latest date for all of them is 550. They go all the way back to 443. 443 to 550. Muhammad was even born to 570. All 4 of those labs, the carbon datings for those manuscripts are before Muhammad's life, before the Qur'an was put, we've even begun, the Qur'an was begun in 610. Before the Qur'an was finished in 652. Before Islam even became. Do you see the problems? Be careful with carbon datings. We would never use carbon datings for our manuscripts because they're so inexact. But more than that, the fact that these three surahs that you're talking about, 18, 19, and 20, look at the stories that are in those three surahs. You have the story of Moses at the burning bush. You have the story of the 7 sleepers in Ephesus. And you have the story of Dhul Qarnayn, who's Alexander the Great. Now, none of these are unique to the Quran, are they? They're all borrowed. But those stories would have all predated the Quran, wouldn't they? So even if you went with the carbon datings, that means these are all older than the Quran because the stories are older. If you're borrowing, that means they were there beforehand. Ooh, I love it. It just makes my job so easy. So be careful of any type of scientific evidence that goes against what we're now finding out with paleographical evidence. Now, Greg, let's continue on from that. Can you then see why Muslims have now kept quiet about these new findings in Kiel, in Zurich, in Lille, and also in Oxford? It's all over, yeah. In fact, it's public information in that the people that are putting it public don't want their names to go with it because they know that they could have death threats. It's published, though. It's right out there. But let's continue on. Regardless of the carbon datings, and the carbon datings are so inexact, no one's using them anymore. Let's go back and let's find out what we do know. What do we know about these 9 manuscripts? We can't find any of them. However, we can find 6 of them that do not come from the 7th century, but the 6 oldest manuscripts that do exist in the world today. Does anybody know what the 6 are, or even one of the 6 are? The Sana, that's one. That's in Yemen. No, not the Birmingham. That's just 2 folios. Topkapi in Istanbul, Turkey. The Petropolitanus in Paris. This man's good. Oh, you took my course. Okay. All right. Well, then you're a good student if you remembered all these. So that's 3 of them. You're halfway there. What's the one in London? The Ma'il. Okay, Ma'il in London. And there's one more real famous one. In Cairo, that's the Husseini. Not so famous, but you're missing the most famous, and that's the Tashkent one, the Samarkand. In Tashkent, Uzbekistan. So you have the Topkapi, which is in Turkey. You have the Samarkand, which is in Tashkent. You have the Ma'il, which is in London. The Petropolitanus, which is in Paris. The Husseini, which is in Cairo. And then the best one, my favorite one, is the Sana'a, which is in Yemen. The newest one that was discovered in just 1975, when they were washing out the dome of the mosque there in Sana'a. They found a trapdoor. They opened the trapdoor, and thousands or hundreds, maybe not thousands, hundreds of manuscripts fell to the ground, which is not uncommon. Whenever Qur'ans start to deteriorate, they hide them up in the mosque domes, and they just leave them up there and they forget them. These had all been forgotten. Most of them were not very old, but the ones that were the most exciting were a number of very, very old manuscripts. They had no diacritical marks, they had no vowelization, proving that they were probably from the 8th or 9th or possibly 10th century. But they couldn't read them because there was no diacritical marks, so they had to fly down 3 German scholars, Dr. Gerd Prin, Dr. von Bothmer, and Dr. Oleg. They flew them down in 1981 to look at these manuscripts and to film them. And they filmed them immediately because they realized that these are the oldest manuscript that they'd ever come across. It was using the Hijazi script, which is a much, much older script. They had no diacritical marks. They had no vowelization, which was to be expected. They pictured every page, page by page, and the Yemeni government overheard what they were saying, and they confiscated all their microfilms. And they did not release those microfilms until 1997. Upon which I went to Germany to talk to them and looked at them, and they gave me some of the facsimiles of what they had found. And boy, has it become juicy. Now, we'll get into that, but let's continue with these 6 manuscripts. What do we know about these 6 manuscripts? We didn't know too much until recently because we had no access to these 6 manuscripts. We were finally given access, not us, but the Muslim scholars, Dr. Tahir Attakulic and Dr. Ekmel Nisanalu, 2 of the world's foremost Muslim scholars on the Arabic text, were given access in 2002. And for 5 years, they looked at these manuscripts. They studied all 6 of them. They did forensic testing on them, and they came up with their conclusions in 2007. That was printed up in 2009. It was translated into English in 2013. I then got hold of it in 2014, and I quickly challenged Dr. Shabir Ali to a debate on these 6 manuscripts. We did that in September of 2014, and it's been up there 4 years now, and all the damage was done within the first 50 minutes of that debate. The reason why is that this is the first time we were able to look at that manuscript. And what we found out is that those manuscripts, and what we found out is that not one of those 6 manuscripts was from the 7th century. Not one of them. Not one of them are these 9 that were sent to 9 different cities. What's more, not one of them was complete. And most devastating, not one of them agreed with each other. And not one of them agreed completely with this book right here. This is the modern Qur'an. This is the Hafs text. So where did this book come from? Anybody know where this book comes from? Cairo, Egypt. You are correct. This is the Cairene text. This is the Hafs text. Now, how many of you knew this before tonight? You did, because you've been following me and you've been my student. The Hafs text is the canonical text of the Quran that I have in my hand today. But this text was only chosen in 1924. That's 94 years ago. In Cairo, because there in Cairo, in the high schools, there was such a multiplicity of Arabic Qurans. There was 37 different Arabic Qurans. Notice, I'm not saying translations. I'm saying Arabic Qurans. These are the original text. There was 37 different Arabic Qurans that they were using, the students were using, that they could not have standardized tests because there are so many differences. We have already counted 60,000 differences between the 37 because we have 31 of them in our possession today. We have salvaged 31 of them in London. Hatun Tash is the one that is responsible for that, from Turkey. And we have our Arabic scholars looking at them, and they've already found 60,000 differences. Back in 1924, it was obvious something needed to be done. There was such a multiplicity of different Qur'ans. So they asked Al-Azhar University, considered to be the greatest Islamic university in the world today, to choose one of the 37. And they chose the one called Hafs. Who is Hafs? Hafs is a student who died in 796, late 8th century. That's 144 years after Muhammad. Never knew Muhammad. Came from Kufa. Didn't even live where Muhammad lived. Lived hundreds of miles away and hundreds of years later. And it was his text that was chosen as the official text for all the high schools in Cairo in 1924. What did they do with all the other texts? They took them all, they took them to the Nile, and they drowned them. They're still in the Nile today, the Nile River. This time they didn't burn them, they drowned them. So whenever you find a Quran that doesn't agree, you either burn it or drown it. That was done 94 years ago. By 1936, they realized that what they had done in Cairo was so successful, because now they could get standardized tests, that they decided to make it nationwide. So all of Egypt then was given the Hafs text. And it was known as the Farouk text, named after King Farouk, who became king in 1936 to 1952. But that was just Egypt. In 1985, in Saudi Arabia, they saw what was happening in Egypt, and they realized that that was so successful in Egypt, they wanted to make this worldwide. So King Fahd, the king at that time in 1985, took the Hafs text and standardized it and canonized it as the official text for all Qurans all over the world. That was only 33 years ago. Which means some of you in this room are older than the Quran. Ooh, Put that under your hat. And yet the Muslims tell us the Quran is eternal. The Muslims tell us it was sent down to a man named Muhammad. The Muslims tell us that it was compiled at the time of Uthman. The Muslims tell us it has never changed. The Quran we have today is exactly like that one in heaven. Can you see from what I've just told you in the last half hour that we can destroy the Quran and every one of those pronouncements? And it's only taken me 30 minutes to do it.